Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. The 26th Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, better known as COP26, kicks off in Glasgow, Scotland on the 31st of October and is scheduled to last until November 12. This is a major moment in international climate diplomacy and the most significant climate change meeting since the Paris Agreement was reached in 2015. Under the terms of the Paris Agreement, countries were to reconvene every 5 years, and these meetings were to be moments in which countries would scale up their ambitions and take further action to limit global warming to well under 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels by 2030. The backbone of the Paris Agreement are what is known as the Nationally Determined Contributions, the NDCs. This is each country's domestic action plan on climate, and as of now, these NDCs collectively do not put us on target to reach that Paris Agreement goal, hence the need for better targets and more action. That is what COP26 is intended to achieve. On the line with me to offer a preview of what to expect from this major UN climate meeting is Pete Odgen, Vice President for Energy, Climate, and the Environment at the United Nations Foundation. He is a veteran of many previous COPs, and in our conversation, he discusses the key issues up for negotiation in Glasgow and the broader geopolitics of climate change diplomacy. This includes a deep dive into how both China and the United States are approaching COP26 and the thorny question of climate finance. That is, how wealthier countries can financially support poorer countries as they adapt to climate change and seek to grow their economies in ways that are not harmful to the environment. I think you will appreciate this conversation. I know I found it to be a very helpful curtain raiser to COP26 in Glasgow. And if you will be there in Glasgow, send me a note. Hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg or send me an email using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. Let me know what's going on, what you're seeing, the mood on the ground. Anything. I suspect many of you listening will actually be there, will be participating in the negotiations or on the sidelines in one way or the other. So do reach out to me. I'd appreciate it. All right. Now here is my conversation with Pete Odgen of the United Nations Foundation. Why is this COP different from all other COPs?
Well, this is often described as the most important COP since the Paris Agreement. And the reason for that has to do actually with the Paris Agreement itself. When countries reach that agreement, they all set national carbon reduction targets, greenhouse gas reduction targets for themselves and for the period for 2030. Some countries, actually, US did 2025, but the idea was that there was going to be an initial set of commitments. Those commitments were not going to get to the goal of the agreement, which is to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and to aim for 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. But the idea was that it was the first step, and that every 5 years, so that was in 2015, so in 2020 and then 2025, countries would come back together, reassess the adequacy of their existing targets and upgrade them, update them to bring us increasingly in line with the ultimate objective of the agreement, and then ideally to nail it. 2020 was, of course, supposed to be the year when everyone was going to come together and do this. Because of COVID, 2021 is the new 2020. And countries sort of got an extra year to go through this process to figure this out. This is the end of that process and the first real check on how countries are doing to make the Paris Agreement function and achieve its objectives.
To what extent is the outcome of Glasgow already baked in? I mean, you have many countries who have already submitted their enhanced and revised nationally determined contributions, those NDCs that make up the backbone of the Paris Agreement. So don't we sort of already know what countries are bringing to the table?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of what makes this an interesting and tricky COP. It's the biggest, COP since the Paris Agreement, but it's an entirely different situation because the Paris Agreement was a negotiation, right? I mean, countries are coming together to finalize, some words on the page, and they were either going to come out with an agreement that every member party could agree to, and that would be success, or they wouldn't, and there would be failure. Here, as you say, we're in the midst of a much more rolling dynamic process of implementation. Countries have been at their own time and in their own way, already increasing their NDCs over the course of the last 5 years. I mean, the Europeans recently, or not so recently now, a year ago, were well on their way towards setting a new NDC for themselves. President Biden last April announced that the U.S. had established a new NDC for itself. And China itself has also submitted an NDC. So, that is a dynamic process. But that's only a piece of what then constitutes this COP outcome. Because for countries to come together in Glasgow, what they need at the end of the day is to rally around a whole package of outcomes, of which this is a piece of it. So one will be, is there a sort of sense among countries that the NDC process, that countries have kind of lived up to it? So this is going to be kind of a political moment of self-reckoning. They're gonna take stock of where we are, face up to the shortfall, and have to give some sort of sense about how they collectively see and are going to reconcile with that discrepancy going forward. But there's also other elements to the Paris Agreement that are going to be very live and part of this broader package of outcomes, and chief among those is the question of climate finance, which is the funding that developed countries had committed to provide to developing countries to help with their transition to a clean and more resilient and sustainable economies. Initially, back in 2009, a pledge was made. It was then enshrined in the Paris Agreement, and one of the big challenges for this COP is going to be reckoning with the fact that developed countries have not made good on that initial finance commitment.
And that commitment was for $100 billion a year.
Yes.
And we are nowhere near that. And, I've heard other analysts explain that, this pledge on making good on that commitment on climate finance is really like a geopolitical linchpin for the outcome of climate negotiations writ large, because it's what will bring the rapidly developing world on board.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge piece again of the overall package here, because so just to say a little bit more about that. So the commitment is specifically for developed countries to mobilize from public and private sources $100 billion annually from 2020 through 2025 in this period. We are not there, and the developed countries are, and frankly, to their credit, not pretending otherwise. We're essentially at about $80 billion as of last accounting. And the hope is, and what the developed countries have rallied around recently, is a projection based on a whole bunch of new commitments for future contributions made by the United States and other developed countries to put us back on a trajectory to meeting it. And that the OECD now calculates that we will be able to get closer to that threshold next year, surpass it in 23 and 24 and so on. So one of the big kind of questions, of course, for this COP is how is this received by developing countries? Are they going to find this, persuasive, having been failed to date? Are they going to see this as a credible way forward? Some countries developing countries are calling for sort of a payment of arrears, as if developed countries would pledge to make up the shortfall in future years. I think what you've seen from the developed country plan that I referenced, there is no sort of agreement on any kind of formal arrears payment, but they do project surpassing 100 billion in coming years, and so that might materially be one and the same. And so how countries feel about that is going to be a huge thing that helps to shape the dynamics here. And the other thing, if you think about it, is this is not money and funding that goes to finance the major economies, right? This is not money that's going to go to China. This is really targeting developing countries who are the least responsible for this, for the impacts, and whose needs are greatest for this kind of support.
And this money presumably will help countries adapt to climate change and also develop in ways that aren't, say, reliant on coal. Are there any other baskets of issues that you expect will come under heavy discussion in Glasgow?
Yeah, there are a couple. There are still outstanding some negotiation issues from Paris having to do with how countries account for how they achieve their NDCs, whether they're using so-called offsets, where countries pay for carbon reductions in a third country and then count those towards their own climate commitments, or if they don't count them. Figuring out how that all gets worked out has been a really tricky issue that I think will hopefully be able to be resolved at this COP. But that does remain one of the last outstanding issues. And again, I think it would be being able to finalize that would be important for the process. Again, just to put this to rest and to be able to move forward. I think that in terms of really the big kind of tectonic questions are going to revolve around the U.S. and China. The big questions around the U.S. are whether the U.S. is going to really be able to deliver on its greenhouse gas reduction targets. I think, broadly speaking, it's the goal that President Biden set for reducing U.S. emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030 has been widely praised, but everyone is waiting now to see what happens. It looks like he's going to go to Glasgow with a framework with $555 billion of climate-related funding in the reconciliation bill. He doesn't have it locked down yet. So I think there's going to be a lot of questions about that. It also has to do with questions about, how the ability of the U.S. to be an enduring force for good inside the climate regime. I mean, we saw, a year ago, President Biden hadn't been elected president. The U.S. was pulling out of the Paris Agreement, and the federal government for 4 years had been hostile to climate action domestically and globally. I think that one of the things that really matured and changed fundamentally during those 4 years, though, was the ability for the U.S. at a subnational level and the private sector, I think, did move forward substantially in those 4 years. And you actually end up with the U.S. with a track record of heightened engagement on those levels. And you'll see that at the COP. I mean, the number of governors who are going to be in Glasgow, the number of mayors, the kind of major private sector commitments, those weren't there 5 years ago. I mean, I think that is going to be a huge kind of demonstration of really long-term commitment apart from the federal at the federal level. That said, what you need to do to get where we need to go and where the world needs to go, it's going to require both. And so I think you're going to really see the Biden administration there in full force. I mean, President Biden's going personally to speak at the Leaders Summit. He has a dozen cabinet and otherwise cabinet level officials all going there on the ground to try to impress upon the world that they understand the urgency of the problem. The other piece, of course, is also on the climate finance. Again, President Biden has really stepped up in his ambition for how much the U.S. can provide. I mean, he at his leader summit, he pledged by 2024 to sort of ramp up climate finance to a level that was going to be, twice the peak Obama era level of climate finance. Then at the General Assembly in September, President Biden agreed to double that again, bringing us up to, by 2024, a commitment to deliver $11.4 billion of funding. So these are big promises. And I think, again, the world is excited about it. I mean, but I think there's, again, the question is, how to rebuild that kind of sense of trust that we're really going to deliver on these things?
So earlier, you said the U.S. and China are obviously the two big players here. You just outlined what the U.S. may or may not be bringing to the table in Glasgow. What's going on with regards to China? I know that President Xi, for example, will not be attending in person. Is that significant? What can we expect from China's diplomacy in Glasgow?
Well, I think along with what the United States does, what China does is going to be of the utmost importance, of the utmost significance on the ability of Glasgow to succeed, much in the same way that the ability to meet the climate challenge depends ultimately on the world's two largest emitters, the US and China, to take the necessary steps to slash their emissions, to make the goals of the Paris Agreement reachable. And while I say the two largest emitters, I mean, we're at a point where the gap between us, between China and the rest of the world, the US included, is growing. I mean, China, as of a couple of years ago, began emitting annually more greenhouse gases than the whole developed world put together. So, and if you put on top of that the goals that the Europeans and now President Biden has set for the U.S. and others in Japan and Korea, and if those ambitions are met, that gap is going to widen. Now, and of course that's a huge challenge. And I think what we've seen, which is very interesting over the past year, there have been some very encouraging signs out of China and some worrying signs. We've seen, they continue to invest very heavily in a lot of clean energy deployment, electric vehicles. They continue to do a lot of things to kind of develop their clean energy economy. They at the General Assembly this year, President Xi announced that they would halt their financing of overseas coal production, of which they had been by far the world's largest state supporter of. This was something that I don't think a lot of people, although they've been pressing China to do that, that really had assumed that they would be willing to make such a commitment. So, those are very significant. They also have set for themselves a target of 2060, by which they will achieve so-called carbon neutrality, which just means that you're to the extent you're emitting emissions, you're also capturing a similar quantity of emissions through agricultural practice and other ways of capturing carbon, which is absolutely where they need to go. And to have President Xi to make such a commitment is not something people take lightly. And they have as a kind of marker on the path to that a commitment to peak their overall emissions by 2030. That said, there's a lot that needs to happen between now and 2060, and they have not yet described and set forth a series of supporting targets and metrics that can give the world confidence that they are charting this course quickly enough, right? I mean, this is something that, given what the trajectory of their emissions, they need to start cutting quickly. They need to start peaking well before 2030. They need to start demonstrating that their energy sector is decarbonizing, that they're not adding new coal capacity, right now, because again, these are steps that are they're pushing further away from that ultimate objective in those regards. So it's a complicated picture. And then you put on top of that the fact that the US and China have such a complicated and difficult relationship right now, bilaterally. Other than, and I think it's interesting. I mean, you have, this year, in this far into the Biden administration, Secretary Kerry, the Special Presidential Envoy Kerry, has been to China to meet with his counterparts a few times. Other than him, the only other high-level official who has gone to China for the entire Biden administration was Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman for a single visit. So it's a pretty interesting situation you have, and where the U.S. is clearly on the climate channel of the relationship, made some efforts to try to draw them into this process in a way that kind of harkens back to during President Obama years, when they were able to find ways to really engage effectively bilaterally and in ways that really bolstered and made possible the Paris Agreement and the biggest victory of the international community on climate change. This time, it's a much more challenging situation, and it's just not clear, what can be achieved bilaterally in this political.
And just to remind listeners, before the Paris Agreement, Obama and Xi came together and jointly made this pledge that therefore lent political momentum and support to the Paris Agreement. Like, one directly flowed into the other.
Absolutely. It was a year before the Paris Agreement was finalized. The U.S. and China came out, President Xi and President Obama. And it's just hard to even imagine it was as recently as it was, stood side by side, literally, and announced to the world that they would put in domestic reduction targets into an agreement. And for both countries, that was politically, for the U.S., having China, the world's largest emitter, as part of the agreement in a way that they were not, and taking on commitments in a way that they had not been under previous regimes, like the Kyoto Protocol, was essential to the whole project, the whole architecture of that agreement, the ability of the U.S. to participate. So once that happened, and the rest of the world understood that, once that happened, that was the starting pistol, and to really signal to the world, there's an end game here. We can get to this agreement. And a year later, we had the Paris Agreement.
So that leads me to my last question, which is, how do you measure success of Glasgow? I mean, earlier you said, at Paris, you can measure success by whether or not, there was a Paris Agreement or not. It was a very sort of clear outcome. Here, the outcome seems a little more like nebulous, or a little like less intuitive. So how would you define whether or not this meeting will become a success?
Yeah, I think that metric is going to be one that's going to be very frustrating for people to apply, because it's not going to be quite so clear cut. I mean, I think that on a very base level, what you need is countries to come together. I mean, this is a big deal to get every country, every party to the Paris Agreement, all to come and agree on what needs to happen next, right? So you need to ultimately have a process that itself holds together, right? That brings together the realities of what countries have and haven't done, what the major economies have and haven't done, what finance has and hasn't been delivered, what process has or hasn't been made in the negotiations. And to be able to wrap that up and to be able to say, given this situation, given how far we've come and how far we still have to go, here we are all determined to go forward together, and we're not giving up, and we have a way, we can show you how we're going to get there to the next steps. So you're going to end up, I think, with a process, and that alone is challenging. I mean, it can become and will be, I think, quite acrimonious at different points, right? I mean, there's questions about you have to build a lot of trust in each other and in the system, and there has to be a lot of sense of solidarity among all countries to do that. I mean, that's what makes, meeting the climate challenge so hard. But I think if we can get there, if we can have that, leave Glasgow with some of that hope and determination with which we left Paris, that would be a success.
Well, Pete, thank you so much for your time. This was very helpful. Good luck out there, and we'll be following.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Pete. That was a very helpful curtain raiser for COP26. And as I mentioned at the outset, please do reach out to me if you're there on the ground in Glasgow. Let me know what's going on, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what the mood is like. I'd be interested and curious to learn from you. All right. We'll see you next time. Bye.